In every age of history, there emerges a commander who changes the very language of war, someone who does not simply fight battles, but rewrites what battle itself means. His victories are studied, his tactics feared, and his name becomes eternal. 2,000 years ago, in the sun-scorched lands of the ancient Mediterranean, such a man arose. His name was Hannibal Barca. To his enemies, he was a monster born of vengeance. To his followers, he was a living legend. And to the Romans, who ruled by iron and believed themselves invincible, he became a nightmare that no army could wake from. What he achieved on the fields of Italy would echo through centuries as both brilliance and horror intertwined, a lesson in how intellect can destroy power. There are moments in history when empires gamble everything on a single confrontation, when pride blinds reason and the fate of nations hangs upon the edge of a sword. One such morning dawned in the merciless heat of August, 216 BCE. Beneath the blazing Mediterranean sun, the largest army Rome had ever assembled marched toward its destiny and its doom. 86,000 soldiers advanced across the dusty plains of southern Italy, their bronze armor glinting like waves of fire. They believed victory was inevitable. Ahead lay a small, quiet village called Cannae, and waiting beyond it, a Carthaginian general who would teach them what true annihilation meant. By sunset, those fields would be unrecognizable. The earth itself would be hidden beneath Roman corpses. Rivers would run red, and the name Hannibal Barca would thunder across the world, not merely as an enemy of Rome, but as a symbol of cunning so profound it bordered on the divine. Cannae was not simply a battle. It was a confrontation between arrogance and genius, discipline and deception. What took place there would defy every rule of ancient warfare. It was not victory, it was extermination, executed with such precision that it nearly broke the Roman Republic apart. The road to this catastrophe began 3 years earlier, when a young commander, barely 26 years old, made one of the boldest moves ever conceived. Hannibal, son of the great Hamilcar who had once drenched Roman soil in Carthaginian blood, lived under an oath sworn before the gods, never to be a friend to Rome. Raised amid the ruins of his father's wars, surrounded by stories of betrayal and revenge, he became a man sculpted by purpose. In 218 BCE, that purpose ignited into action. With an army of hardened soldiers, war elephants, and fierce cavalry, Hannibal set forth from Spain and attempted the impossible, the crossing of the Alps. The world thought him mad. The mountains devoured men by the thousands. Avalanches, starvation, and freezing winds turned the journey into hell. Yet Hannibal pressed on. Half his army perished, but those who survived emerged transformed, an unbreakable brotherhood of warriors drawn from across the Mediterranean. Iberian swordsmen with deadly curved blades, Celtic fighters with massive shields and iron hearts, African spearmen gleaming beneath the snow, and the swift, spectral Numidian horsemen whose sudden charges could break any line. When this unlikely host descended into the fertile Po Valley, Rome's pride made the next step inevitable. Outraged that a foreign invader had dared to tread upon Italian soil, the Senate sent out its legions in force. They believed numbers would crush audacity. But Hannibal had already chosen the stage for their humiliation. On a bitter winter morning at the river Trebia, Consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus led 40,000 Romans across the freezing waters, their armor stiff with frost, their limbs numb from the cold. The instant they reached the opposite bank, Hannibal struck. His cavalry stormed the flanks, his hidden troops erupted from the rear, and the Roman line collapsed in panic. Within hours, 20,000 were dead, their blood steaming on the snow-covered ground. The survivors who crawled back to Rome brought stories that no one wanted to believe. How could the invincible legions, the pride of the Republic, be shattered by an army of foreigners and mercenaries? But the truth was undeniable. Hannibal's power did not lie in numbers, it lay in the mind. He saw battle as others saw art, every move deliberate, every risk calculated. He could read the land like a map of destiny, predict his enemies' thoughts, and strike where they were weakest before they even knew they were exposed. To Hannibal, war was not chaos. It was a language, one only he could speak fluently. And on the plains of Cannae, that language would reach its most terrifying perfection. Spring offered no reprieve. The year was 217 BCE, and the Italian countryside trembled beneath the shadow of a man who had mastered the art of war. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who had crossed the Alps against all odds, now prepared to demonstrate once again that audacity, when paired with genius, could rewrite the laws of battle. At Lake Trasimene, his forces waited in absolute silence. The early morning mist rolled across the still waters, shrouding the hills like a funeral veil. Hidden behind those hills, Hannibal's army, a coalition of Africans, Spaniards, and Gauls, crouched in readiness. They could hear the rhythmic tramp of Roman sandals approaching. The legions of Gaius Flaminius, confident and unaware, were marching straight into a nightmare. When the first ranks reached the narrow shore, horns split the fog, and the world erupted in chaos. From a mist poured a storm of Carthaginian steel. Spears fell like rain, shouts turned to screams, and in moments the proud Roman formation dissolved into panic. Trapped between the lake and the slopes, there was nowhere to run. 15,000 men perished before a single line could form. Many tried to flee into the water, but their armor dragged them down. The lake itself became a grave. When it was over, the head of Flaminius was severed and sent to Carthage, not as mere proof of victory, but as a grim message. Rome's gods had turned away. For the first time in living memory, Rome was afraid. Smoke rose from fields that had fed generations. Refugees flooded the capital, their stories soaked in terror. In the Senate, the air was thick with rage and despair. Some demanded negotiation, others revenge. The people wailed, mothers clutching their children, praying to gods who suddenly seemed deaf. And then, through that storm of panic, a single steady voice emerged, Quintus Fabius Maximus. Named dictator in the Republic's darkest hour, he proposed something Rome was not built to understand: patience. He would not seek decisive glory, but survival. He would stalk Hannibal, wear him down, choke off his supplies, and deny him the open confrontation he craved. It was wisdom disguised as cowardice. The Romans, heirs to centuries of conquest, could not comprehend restraint. They mocked Fabius as cunctator, the delayer. The name stung. To them, every delay was shame, every cautious step an insult to Roman pride. Yet while they burned with a hunger for vengeance, Hannibal remained unbeaten, and his legend grew like wildfire. By 216 BCE, restraint was no longer tolerable. The Senate's patience had broken. They demanded victory, swift and absolute. 2 new consuls were elected, men as different as the two halves of Rome itself. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, seasoned and grave, preached caution. He had seen what happened to those who rushed against Hannibal's cunning. His colleague, Gaius Terentius Varro, was fire and thunder, a populist, a man of the people, born to defy fear with fury. Where Paulus counseled discipline, Varro called him timid. The Republic, Varro insisted, must cleanse its shame with blood. Their conflict mirrored the soul of Rome, wisdom battling pride, reason clashing with rage. Then came the spark that lit the inferno, news that Hannibal had seized the fortress of Cannae, a vital depot that stored the grain of southern Italy. Its loss was more than a military blow. It was symbolic, a wound to the Republic's pride and a threat to its allies' loyalty. Rome had no choice now. It would strike back with everything it had. Orders went out to assemble the greatest army the Republic had ever fielded. 8 legions, over 40,000 Roman citizens, joined by an equal number of Italian allies. Old veterans stood beside untested youths. Senators, equestrians, and ambitious officers rode at the front, their armor gleaming, their hearts swollen with certainty that this war would end in triumph. In Rome, the people lined the streets as the army departed. Cheers echoed through the city gates. Priests blessed the banners of the eagle. No one doubted victory. They told themselves that Hannibal's past triumphs had been illusions, tricks of terrain and deceit. On the open plains, they said, Roman might would crush him utterly. Around the campfires that night, young soldiers joked about how they would divide Carthaginian spoils. Some swore they would bring back Hannibal's head. Far to the south, Hannibal prepared in silence. He studied the terrain around the village of Cannae like an artist studying marble before carving. Every dune, every shadow, every gust of wind was measured and memorized. The Aufidus River curled through a wide, sun-blasted plain, the perfect stage for what he intended. A trap so intricate it would be remembered for 2,000 years. As the two armies advanced toward one another, the air itself seemed to tighten. Hannibal's scouts shadowed the Roman legions day and night, counting every cohort, mapping every camp, and measuring each day's march. When they returned, they reported numbers that would have made lesser commanders lose sleep. Over 80,000 men. But Hannibal was unmoved. His calm was almost inhuman, the calm of a chess master who already knew the final move. The Roman host was a spectacle beyond imagination. Legion after legion marched in flawless rhythm, their shields blazing in the sunlight. The roar of tens of thousands of sandals striking earth rolled like thunder across the fields. Overhead, the eagles of Rome glinted like miniature suns. This was more than an army. It was the Republic made flesh. At its head rode Paulus and Varro, the twin faces of Rome's ambition and pride. Their alternating command, one day each, was meant to preserve balance, but would soon doom them both. Varro's speeches were fiery, his promises extravagant. He told the soldiers that Hannibal was finished, that the invader led a mob held together only by fear and plunder. The younger troops believed every word, their confidence swelling like the summer heat. Paulus, meanwhile, carried the weight of foreboding. He had read every account of Trebia and Trasimene and saw the pattern others missed. Hannibal did not merely fight, he orchestrated. His army was not a mob, but a living mechanism, each part tuned to his will. Paulus feared that this battle would not be fought on Roman terms, but on Hannibal's stage. When at last the legions reached the plains of Cannae, they saw the Carthaginian army arrayed below the old fortress walls. To Roman eyes, it looked pitiful, a patchwork of tribes and mercenaries, far fewer in number. The Romans smiled, certain this would be easy. They did not notice the wind blowing dust into their faces. They did not understand that every inch of this ground had been chosen with care. As night fell, the two camps became mirrors of anticipation. In the Roman tents, armor was polished, blades were sharpened, and men whispered prayers to Mars. The younger soldiers laughed too loudly, trying to silence the tremor in their chests. The veterans sat apart, silent, staring into the flames. They knew what dawn could bring. Across the field, Hannibal's camp thrummed with quiet purpose. Spaniards whetted curved blades against stone. Gauls painted their faces with blue spirals, grim totems of war. The swift Numidian cavalry tended their horses, whispering to them like old friends. The African infantry, Hannibal's disciplined corps, laid out their weapons in immaculate rows. Hannibal himself walked among them, speaking softly in each man's tongue. To the Gauls, he promised revenge. To the Spaniards, wealth. To the Africans, eternal honor. They listened, not as mercenaries, but as disciples. Their loyalty was forged not from fear, but from belief. Belief in the man who had led them across mountains and deserts and now promised them immortality. When the stars burned high overhead, Hannibal summoned his officers. Under the faint glow of a single lamp, he traced lines in the dust, a plan that bordered on madness. He would invite the Romans to strike where he seemed weakest. His center, composed of Gauls and Spaniards, would give ground deliberately, bending under the Roman weight. And when the enemy was deep within, his African infantry, silent and disciplined, would close from both flanks like jaws. At that same moment, his cavalry, having routed the Roman horse, would sweep behind them, sealing every path of escape. It was a design born of genius and audacity, a symphony of deception and precision. In the morning, the plains of Cannae would witness not just another battle, but the perfection of destruction, the moment when one man's mind turned war into art. It was a trap unlike any other ever conceived, a feat of precision so daring it bordered on the impossible. Every movement, every breath of wind had been accounted for. It demanded flawless timing, unshakable trust between men, and the kind of iron resolve that only those who had already faced death could possess. A single hesitation, a single misstep would mean disaster. Yet if it worked, the Roman army, the greatest military force the ancient world had ever seen, would not merely suffer defeat. It would vanish from history as if swallowed by the earth itself. The dawn that rose over the plains of Cannae was a cruel one, blinding, breathless, and heavy with the weight of destiny. As the first rays of the August sun poured across the Apulian fields, they revealed two armies standing on the brink of annihilation. Trumpets called through the morning haze. Shields clanged into place. Priests murmured hurried prayers to indifferent gods. Every soldier there, Roman and Carthaginian alike, knew that by nightfall, the ground beneath their feet would be red with blood. From a low ridge overlooking the battlefield, Hannibal Barca watched as the fog began to lift from the banks of the Aufidus River. The air shimmered with heat, the wind carried the scent of dust and iron, and the Carthaginian general stood silent, his gaze fixed on the plain where he would test not only his enemies but his own destiny. His weathered hands traced the familiar contours of the landscape one final time. Every slope, every ridge, every twist of the river had been memorized in painstaking detail. To Hannibal, the battlefield was not chaos, it was a canvas, and today he would paint his masterpiece in blood. Since childhood, when his father Hamilcar had sworn him before the gods to eternal enmity with Rome, this moment had been his inheritance. He had crossed mountains that no general dared to cross, defied empires that ruled the seas, and shattered every army sent against him. Yet none of it compared to what he planned this day. This would be his reckoning, his chance to break Rome's spine and reshape the fate of the ancient world forever. Hannibal's formation was as deceptive as it was deliberate. In the center, he positioned his least disciplined troops, the Gauls and Spaniards. They were fierce fighters but unreliable in the long struggle. Their purpose was not victory, but endurance. Their deaths would buy time and illusion. Behind them, hidden from the view of the Roman front, stood the hardened core of his army, the African veterans. These were soldiers who had marched through the Alps beside their commander, who had faced storms, starvation, and countless battles. They wore scavenged Roman armor polished to a mirror shine, transforming them into ghostly reflections of the enemy they were about to destroy. On the wings, his cavalry prepared for the storm. The Numidians, agile riders from the North African plains, sat easy in their saddles, their javelins balanced with effortless grace. Their horses, lean and restless, pawed at the ground in anticipation. Beside them waited the heavy cavalry of Spain and Gaul, great bearded men clad in chain and leather, gripping long swords and spears. These would be the hammer blows of the battle, the thunder that followed lightning. But before they could strike, they had to destroy the Roman cavalry, the shield guarding the flanks of the legions. Across the plain, the Romans readied themselves with the calm pride of men who had never known true defeat. 80,000 soldiers stood in tight formation, a human wall of bronze and flesh. Consul Vero, the Roman commander that day, had chosen to fight not with subtlety, but with overwhelming force. Instead of spacing his maniples for flexibility, he had packed them densely together, a colossal wedge of men designed to crush anything before it through sheer momentum. To the Romans, this was strength. To Hannibal, it was the first crack in their armor. The ranks were a living machine of war. At the front, the hastati, young men, still untested, their faces pale beneath their helmets. Behind them, the principes, veterans hardened by years of conquest. And behind them, the triarii, old warriors, their eyes cold, their spears ready, Rome's final line of survival. Together, they formed the might of an empire that believed itself invincible. None among them could have imagined that by sunset, they would stand trapped within their own creation, a wall that would become their grave. Between the two armies stretched a no-man's land, barely 300 yards of shimmering dust and silence. Vultures drifted overhead, circling lazily, as if they already knew the feast that awaited. The heat grew unbearable. Then, without warning, the stillness broke. A roar erupted, the deep, rolling thunder of cavalry charging from both flanks. The earth trembled under the onslaught of hoofs. Numidian riders moved like shadows, hurling their javelins and vanishing into dust clouds, while the heavier Spanish and Gallic cavalry crashed into the Roman horsemen with unstoppable fury. The clash of steel echoed across the plain, a sound that seemed to shake the heavens. As the cavalry battle raged, Hannibal lifted his arm, the signal for the infantry to advance. The center surged forward, a wall of Gauls and Spaniards screaming war cries that tore through the dry air. They knew the odds. They knew most would die. Yet they charged with a terrible determination, fueled by loyalty, pride, and the magnetic will of their commander. The Roman legions answered with thunderous precision. 80,000 sandals struck the earth in perfect rhythm. The impact when the two lines met was cataclysmic. Spears shattered like glass, shields splintered, and the world dissolved into chaos. Hannibal's center bent beneath the crushing weight of the Roman advance, men dying by the hundreds, blood soaking the dust. The line wavered, but it did not break. To the Romans, it looked like victory. The enemy was retreating. The Carthaginian line was folding in on itself. Trumpets blared triumphantly. Officers shouted to press the attack. Legionaries roared as they drove forward. Yet what seemed like the collapse of Hannibal's army was, in truth, the tightening of his snare. The Carthaginian line curved inward deliberately, drawing the Roman legions deeper into the pocket. Every step they took compressed their formation. Every push forward robbed them of space to maneuver. What had begun as an advance now became a slow suffocation. Then, as if on cue, the battlefield shifted. The African infantry, silent and unyielding, pivoted inward from both flanks, forming walls of bronze that closed around the Roman sides. At that same moment, Hannibal's victorious cavalry swept in from the rear, sealing the trap. The Romans, too packed to move, suddenly found themselves surrounded on all sides. The realization came too late. Panic spread through the ranks like wildfire. Men turned and screamed, but there was nowhere to go. Those at the front were crushed by those behind them. Spears rose and fell blindly, stabbing friend and foe alike. The air grew thick with dust and blood. In the center, thousands suffocated where they stood, their bodies locked upright by the press of flesh around them. By mid-afternoon, the Roman army ceased to exist as a fighting force. The battle had become slaughter. The ground was slick with blood. Shields floated in rivers of red mud. Hannibal's men moved methodically, cutting down the trapped soldiers until silence began to fall over the plain. When the sun finally dipped toward the horizon, the fields of Cannae were covered with corpses as far as the eye could see. 70,000 Romans had died in a single day. It was not merely a defeat, it was the dismemberment of an empire's pride. The legend of Roman invincibility had been broken. Hannibal's double envelopment at Cannae would become immortal, studied by generals for millennia, from Napoleon to Eisenhower. It was the ultimate expression of intellect triumphing over brute strength, of psychology wielded as a weapon sharper than any blade. Rome would rise again, rebuilt from the ashes of its arrogance, and one day destroy Carthage utterly. But on that sweltering August day in 216 BCE, it was Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, heir to vengeance, who stood as the undisputed master of the world. And in the silence that followed the slaughter, as the sun sank behind the blood-soaked horizon, history itself bowed before the genius of a man who had turned war into art, proving that victory belongs not to the strongest, but to those who understand the hearts of men.